Hello and welcome back to this week's episode. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about the history of midwifery and their origin also. I'm going to start off this episode by stating a fun fact, and that is that in 2012, 98.6% of all of our births in the United States took place in a hospital, with about 92% attended by physicians, known as OBGYNs. However, that is not the case for other countries like the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Japan. In these countries, midwives actually outnumber OBGYNs. And why is that? And the answer lays in our history. So all the way back to the 13 colonies of America, midwives actually attended almost all of the births in America. They would practice from their homes and they would pass their knowledge on to other women, and they would teach each other informally. And these midwives actually came from Britain. Also, West African midwives that would come to the United States, well, actually not the United States in that moment, but that would come to America as slaves, they would attend the births of Black and white women in the antebellum South. And actually, after emancipation occurred, African American midwives continued to take care of Black and white poor women in rural parts of the South, and these midwives were referred to as granny midwives. With few schools to prepare midwives, laws requiring education couldn't be enforced, and because there were very few doctors willing to attend poor women, it actually wasn't even practical to outlaw midwives. And in compared to other areas like Europe, midwives actually had national laws that actually did enforce education, but that wasn't the case. And midwives in most states practiced without government control until the 1920s, and even today, regulation of midwifery is different from state to state. An example for this is in Texas, midwives actually have to be working with a physician. However, in New Mexico, for example, a midwife can work without the authority of a physician. So what happened? Why now in our present, most physicians are the ones that are attending births and not midwives? And that is because of competition. And it wasn't until the last half of the 1800s where medicine became professionalized. It did so in a spirit of competition. And so when this occurred, midwives attended only about half of all the births in the United States, and the physicians attended the other half. And this was in the beginning of the 20th century. So what happened? Why did this drastic change occur? And what happened is that there were two reports of medical education that were published in 1910 and 1912 that basically said that America's OBGYNs were poorly trained, and in order to improve training, one of the reports recommended that hospitalization for all deliveries was necessary, and rather than poor women consulting with midwives, they would have to attend charity hospitals, and these hospitals would actually be sites for doctors that were in training. A very important obstetrician in 1915, his name was Dr. Joseph D. Lee. He was one of the authors, he was actually the author of one of the most important obstetric textbook of that era. He basically described childbirth as a process that damages both mothers and babies. He didn't really see it as a natural process. He kind of said it in a form that it was a very destructive was a very destructive process that happened and didn't view it as a normal. So basically this caused midwives to not even be mentioned. And so in the first issue of the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, he proposed a series of interventions designed to, quote me on this, save women from the evils natural to labor. So this included a routine to use sedatives, forceps, episiotomies, and so on, which you might think would be a good thing, but it actually wasn't that. Well, we'll talk about it later in this episode, but let's continue. Dr. Deely was the head of obstetrics at Northwestern University, and he was the chairman of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Chicago. So all of the interventions he proposed was applied to every woman in labor instead of only a small number of women who actually had a diagnosed problem. No, there were medical interventions for every woman in labor. So currently today we are still practicing under the ideology of Dr. Deely. And you might think that other wealthy countries use the same interventions, but actually in other developed countries have national health services in which elements of care that aren't needed or that don't improve the health of a patient, they tend to not be used because of the cost. However, in our healthcare industry, the more care that is provided to a patient, there is more money made by doctors and hospitals. So there is a less incentive to not use these methods. So where did midwives go? Physicians like Dr. Deely and others who thought like him, they would argue that midwives were untrained and they weren't knowledgeable enough, and that pregnancy is a very dangerous condition that requires care from highly trained medical specialists, and that most patients that midwives attended to were mainly poor women, and poor women were needed to provide clinical experience for trained doctors in charity hospitals. So that's how midwives slowly became extinct. In 1900, midwives attended about half of all of the births, but by 1935, they attended less than 15% of the births. And in the early 1930s, most midwives that were practicing were black or poor white granny midwives, like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, and they worked in the South. As midwives decline, the amount of mothers that died because of childbirth, and also including infants, would die, and there was a lot of birth injuries, they increased. So midwives declined and all of these tragic events increased. So there was a scholar who conducted a study, and he found that the 41% increase in infant mortality was due to birth injuries between 1915 and 1929 was due to obstetrical interference and birth. And so as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Deely proposed medical intervention for all births. So the data points that this wasn't the most optimal answer or solution. However, midwifery did come back slowly to the United States in the form of nurse midwifery with the help of the Frontier Nursing Service that was founded in a rural county in Kentucky in 1925 by Mary Breckinridge. Mary worked as a public health nurse for the Red Cross at the end of World War I in France. And while she was over there, she met British nurse midwives who the British midwives had a combination of training that Mary considered essential and that she had to bring it back to the poor families in Kentucky. Up until the mid-1950s, nurse midwives only attended home births, up until when obstetric physicians developed midwifery services within their departments to help them deal with the post-war baby boom. So essentially, a lot of babies were beginning to, well, as it says, baby boom. There was a bunch of, so they got overwhelmed, right? And so obstetric leaders decided to install services of nurse midwifery in hospitals. And this would improve the quality of care in hospitals. Nurse midwives actually only cared for the poor for almost 50 years. And by the early 1960s, fewer than 70 nurse midwives were in practice in the United States. And despite the small amount that they had, they were very influential. They introduced a concept of family-centered maternity care, which played a major role in the development of childbirth education, and it demonstrated the concept of mother-baby rooming, and they urged mothers to breastfeed at a time when most hospitals were teaching them how to make formula and sterilize bottles. So a lot more holistic and a lot more personal. And studies documented cost savings and good outcomes from nurse midwifery care. And the nurse midwife's role began to expand in the 60s and the 70s. Most CNMs work in obstetric department of hospitals. However, there was a desire to avoid routine use of medical interventions that motivated them to develop birth centers and escape or kind of avoid medical interventions that weren't necessary. And so, until today, 95% of births that are attended by CNMs, they do occur in hospitals, but CNMs also attend home births and births in birth centers away from hospitals. So we've come to the end of this episode. I hope you guys liked learning about the history of midwifery. I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.